everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Tracy Matthews. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. We're excited about today. We're excited to have so many of you with us. It's a very good-looking room here. A few representatives from faculty, staff, students, community members, so welcome. Today's teach-in is on racism and activism, and I'm just going to kind of give us the logistics for the day, and then I'm going to turn it over for some welcome remarks. But let me just say one thing before I do that is that I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of this event today. So most immediately, there was a student-led demonstration in solidarity with the students at Mizzou back in the fall. I think it was led by OBS and PYP 100, and some of us we participated, but also we were talking amongst ourselves, and Michael Dawson, the director of the Race Center, sent an email to a few of us and said, we should have a teach-in. And we all said, yeah. And so now we're here at the teach-in. And I want to say thank you to all the people who participated on the planning committee. If you were on the committee, could you just raise your hands? Yay. I also want to acknowledge the Center for Identity and Inclusion for their support in making this program happen. And I especially want to thank Dara Epperson, who's the program coordinator at the Race Center, who managed all the logistics to make this day possible. So we could never have done it without all her hard work. And thank you to all the volunteers, to all the speakers. I think today is going to be a really exciting set of conversations, and we feel like we're in conversation with the discussions that have happened before today on this campus about the issue of race and institutional racism. And also we hope that this will be continued with events that will follow. And hopefully you all will have some ideas today about what we should talk about next. So basically today we're going to have 2 panels and then breakout sessions at lunchtime. So our first panel is going to be on institutional racism in the University of Chicago, and then we're going to have a lunch breakout session. I think everybody signed up for a session. If you haven't, we can figure that out when we break for lunch. Most of those sessions are going to be across the alleyway at the Race Center, and then one will be here in this room. There'll be people to direct you how to get back and forth between the 2 sites. And you'll take your lunches with you to your breakout session. And then we'll have a final panel on activism on and off campus back here in this room. And after that panel, we'll have kind of a closing session, speak out, report back, where we'll talk about what we learned today and talk about our plans moving forward. There is a suggestion basket out at the front, so at any time during the course of the day, if you have ideas about things that we should do differently, or things that we should do next, or just general feedback about the day, please put something in the suggestion box, and we're hopefully going to be able to look at some of that and bring it to the final session. We hope that people will live tweet, and the hashtag is CSRPC Teach-In. We're also live streaming, hopefully. Yes, we are. Thank you, Julius. Let's thank Julius for the live stream. I also want to remind people that there are resources on the Race Center website, and especially direct your attention to the syllabus of readings that was put together by the Black Metropolis Research Consortium and Camille Brewer. I want to thank them for putting together the syllabus. I want to let people know that there are deans on call if you need some support. Currently we have LaTanja Ellis at the back of the room. She's raising her hand if anybody needs some support. She's here. Thank you, LaTanja. Have I forgotten anything here? Okay. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael Dawson, who's the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and then he'll be followed by Ariel Stevenson, who graduated from the college last year and who was a student leader on campus. Michael?
to everyone for coming to this teaching on race and activism. And I also want to thank, in addition to Darren, Julius, and colleagues and staff, as anyone who knows anything about the center knows, this would not happen without Tracy Matthews. We're here today to learn from each other and discuss how to move forward from a situation where racist incidents aimed at community members have become a recurring phenomenon, and within a citywide and national context of increasing racial tensions and growing activism to deal with the system of racial injustice, which in turn intersect with issues of gender and religious injustice. When thinking about my opening comments, I was reminded of many of the incidents of racism and my own activism going back to my time as a student at the lab school. When I was at the lab school, one of my very best friends, a black male, was called a nigger by one of the teachers. Another teacher told me that he wouldn't recommend the most qualified person, another black student, for a scholarship because what would he do with a college education? A couple of years later, I witnessed, I didn't participate sadly, as black workers on this campus and on the south side with the Black Panther Party shut down work sites on this campus because the unions had segregated the workforce and black workers and workers of color were not allowed to participate. My senior year in high school, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And there was a debate among some black people in neighboring communities about whether the university should be attacked because it's such a massive symbol of institutional racism on the south side of Chicago. When I came back a year and a half later for winter break, the city was even more tense as in the wake of the assassination by the police of activist Fred Hampton. A few years later, I remember when racist graffiti was spraying on my cubicle in graduate school, only to be told that it didn't happen because things like that don't happen in the academy. And as a young assistant professor at another university, although I could imagine this happening here to tell you the truth, a famous professor of political science said public transportation was for people who ate fried chicken and could not fathom why this was racist and classist. I mean, he literally could not understand why this might be construed as a racist comment by his graduate students who were in the seminar at the time. That incident was one of the many that led to, in the 1980s, to a climate survey on racism and sexism being conducted by the department in question, similar to the one that's being conducted here 20 years later. These incidents all led me to my activism as a very young student, community, and union organizer. And they also taught me at an early age that American universities, including definitively the University of Chicago, like other major American institutions, were not only not immune to the types of biases, racism, and systemic patterns of disadvantage based on race, gender, religious faith, and sexuality, but were all too often an active participant in the reproduction of patterns of subordination, bias, and disadvantage. This is true whether we're talking about religious bigotry, racism, that's historically understood as a system of white supremacy, sexism, or homophobia. At the University of Chicago, we are sometimes particularly guilty of thinking that within the halls of academia, we are both immune to these practices of subordination, and that indeed we are above it all. On campuses throughout the country, student activism of my generation led to a substantial, by no means satisfactory, surge in levels of enrollment of students of color, as well as establishment of gender and ethnic studies programs and departments. There are other hard-won victories that were the direct result of activism, the most important perhaps of which was the dismantling of formal institutions of Jim Crow. Now, a generation later, we see some changes for the better, but not only does much work remain to be done, but in some domains we have stagnated and in others we have moved backwards. We know only too well that not enough has changed. All too often, the University of Chicago still acts as an imperial power with respect to public and private lands in black neighborhoods. This is still too often a hostile environment for staff, students, and community residents of color. Students and other members of color are still confronted for being here, and when they assert their right to be present like other members of the community, sometimes the police are called. At the last school, students of color still face bias from within the school. And as we know from a recent incident, fraternity racism is an ongoing phenomenon that has targeted members of the Black, Muslim, Latino, and Palestinian communities on this campus. Nationally, this is in the context of increased activism aimed at to protest the murders of people of color by the police, whether it's Rexia Boyd and Laquan McDonald in Chicago, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in New York City, or Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Citizens of color are not even safe all too often from the racist intent of their fellow citizens, as the 2012 case of Trayvon Martin reminds us. The physical violence has been accompanied by an increase in racist discourse and attitudes that have been solidly documented by academic survey research centers. We're also confronting violence of another sort. Communities of color, particularly poor, brown, and black ones across the country, not just Flint, are more likely to see their air and water polluted in worst cases, critical levels. And the 2016 presidential campaign has seen vicious and racist attacks aimed at immigrants, particularly Latino immigrants, and attacks against those of the Muslim faith. Some leading candidates we know from current survey research and exit polls are surging due to their conscious mobilization of those who are anti-black, anti-immigrant, and anti-Muslim. It's fair to say that the racial climate in the United States is toxic, as it is in Chicago, and is experienced the same by all too many members of our local community. Fortunately, activists are once again meeting these challenges in Chicago citywide, and nationally. As it was a generation ago, young people, including students, are more often than not taking the lead. Student community activists organize to force the university to live up to its responsibilities to the surrounding community by creating a level 1 trauma center. And students have been active in organizing against local examples of racism and bigotry. On the far south side, students at predominantly black Chicago State are organizing and protesting to open a 150-year-old predominantly black institution that is facing a possible closure this spring. Slave state politicians are showing the same type of neglect and callousness toward communities of color with respect to Chicago State that we see demonstrated communities from Ferguson to Flint. The city and nationally, whether in the national marches of 2006 in support of immigrant and human rights, and the movement to counter attacks on black lives, social movements have once again forced the country to confront issues of race and racism. Activists in this era are in some ways more advanced than the ones in my youth. Often they lead with conscious attention to providing a feminist, queer, and anti-racist leadership, although there is predictable resistance by some elements within our communities. As we'll see in today's session, technology is being increasingly mobilized by activists, not only to map, for example, the expansion of this university into surrounding neighborhoods over time, but also by activists to facilitate mobilization. But this generation's movements are still very young, relatively weak, and need to be nourished, sharpened, and spread. As I mentioned at the start, today we come to learn from each other and collectively discuss where we have been, where we are, where we need to go, and how do we get there. Our first panel will be a discussion with internal university-specific institutional racism or role of university in fighting and or reproducing racial inequality on the south side and within the city of Chicago, both historically and in this period. Our second panel is a discussion on the connection between the growing activism movements on campus and those taking place city and nationwide. We end, as Tracy mentioned, with a speak out of our discussion to begin to outline, to quote Dr. Martin Luther King, where do we go from here? It should be emphasized that this is not a one and done event. This is the first in a long process of work to make this university, city, and world a just place for us all. Thank you again, and let us get to work.
How y'all doing today? Right. And you smoothed it. Okay. So I graduated in June, and in my senior year, senior year was when the summer before my senior year was when Ferguson happened. started. And so all through fall quarter, my 4th year, I was kind of just thinking about those things and kind of, as a student here, how do I interact with my friends who some of them don't understand, as smart as they are, they don't understand a lot of the racial intersections between what we do here at school, how we are as friends, and how I live my personal life aside from them. And when the verdict actually was announced, it was really taxing on me. I was with my friend at Native Foods up the street, and I was sitting across from 2 police officers, and I remember looking at my phone and seeing that the news broke, and no one in the store was like really, nothing was happening. Like there was no one really upset, there was no one looking at their phone and like being really emotional like I was, and it was really odd for me because I'm not a very emotional person speaking. I'm more dramatic, I would say, than I am emotional, which I guess John can be emotional. But I was really upset, and I remember thinking, like, I have to do something. And I'm friends with Stephanie, who is an organization of Black students. And I remember reaching out to, not Stephanie at the time, because I know she was really busy, but I remember reaching out to a friend of mine, Vincente Perez, as well as Tovia Siegel, Tovia has graduated as well. Vincente is still a student here. And I was like, I'm really interested in maybe having a die-in, something that was happening at other campuses, various other places in public to raise awareness of what happened. And that was my first time really being an activist of sorts. I've always been a person of action, I guess you would say. This one won't sound cocky, it's kind of just the truth. I kind of want to do things as opposed to talking. Because sometimes talking can be easily, like, people don't really question you when you speak sometimes, but an action can really, it speaks for itself, you know? So I organized a die-in in the front of the Regenstein Library during reading period. No, University of Chicago, don't block the entry to the Regenstein. Which is why I wanted to have it there, because you can't deny the presence of bodies and emotion and sadness and anger and the need to discuss something when it's in front of the library. You can really see people who really get really flustered and upset over blocking an entrance into a library when people are dying in the streets. So it makes you kind of have to question what's going on. Before that, though, that was my first act as like an activist, which is really funny to say by myself. As a student here, I went through several, I would say, stages of wokeness. If you know what that means, like being woke, I guess. It's funny. So when I first got here, it's my first year, I'm from Dallas, Texas. I went to a predominantly Black high school up until my sophomore year, where I transferred to a performing arts school, which was a really racially mixed place. So that was the first time I had met Jewish persons, first time I had really had a Muslim friend. All these things, and it didn't really make a difference to me. Like, I was just like, that's cool, it's awesome. Never really talked to anyone, go for it, you know. So when I got to school, I chose this school mainly because of that. I felt that I could be myself here. It was between here and SMU. So, I was really excited to come here, and I remember, like, my orientation week, I was just so tired. Like, I didn't know what was going on. My mom was gone, like, this is far away from home. I wasn't, like, sad or anything. I was just, like, tired. I don't know why. So I didn't really go to any events. I did not know we had an organization of Black students. I did not know we had a number of things. Really, the only thing I knew that we had was the crew team, because I was interested in being on the crew team, and so I had investigated it. So I joined the crew team my fall quarter of my first year, and my big sister on the team was Kathy Stewart, who graduated from here, and she was Black as well. We were like the only 2 Black girls on the team. Crew is not a racially diverse sport, mainly because of I'm gonna say, I think it's, if I think about it, I think it's mainly the cost and also the location you have to be in to do such a sport. So we would go places and we get some looks. We have a fairly racially diverse team. Like, I would say the crew team, looking at it, does not really reflect university because there is like, it's just the minority on the team are white people, which is weird. So we go places and we get looks, people are like, we really like your team, you guys are really nice. You know, so I didn't understand all of the interactions necessarily that we had off campus and our presence in the Midwest and later on the national fields as we kind of dominated. Because you didn't know, the crew team is really good here, by the way. So, going forth into my second year, I was still living on campus and I was getting more involved in the crew team. And I wasn't really aware still that we had organizing of Black students until my spring quarter of my second year. I took the politics of Blackness in the Americas. And I remember walking into the class and being like, oh my God, it's like only 3 people in here. Like, this is so crazy. So I had no idea. All the people on campus I had never even seen. Like, where were they? Why had I not met them? These people who were amazing to listen to speak in class. Like, their thoughts and how they worded everything was moving to me. So I wanted to make an effort to really be involved with more people of color on campus, because we have people of color on campus, and I didn't know that. So I wanted to learn more about that. But then I studied abroad. And when I studied abroad, I was just expecting to go somewhere and be American, not necessarily a Black American, or as I learned when I was in Paris, that I was not Black, I was not American. You have to be from Africa. Where are you from? You must be from Ghana. No, you must be from Senegal. No, girl, you're not from America. No way. I'm like, okay, but like, yeah, I totally am. I'm telling you right now, I'm from Dallas, Texas, I promise. So it really opened my eyes to even more racial, how I identify as a Black person and as a Black woman. I'm just gonna take this off and hold it because this is weird. Okay. So as that happened, when I came back to school, I was really immersing myself in like readings about feminism, institutional racism, and I would say this was when I was really like starting to like investigate myself and people around me. And so a lot of people did not really measure up to how I wanted to, the people I wanted to put around me to better myself and also maybe to help better other people. So I like lost a lot of friends. I became really like, had a really small circle of friends I felt comfortable being myself with. So as I graduated from this, my senior year, I would say, was when I had like the most influence on campus, I guess. I feel like a lot of people knew who I was, and it's really weird for me to think on now. People knew who I was, and I didn't know who these people were and why they knew who I was. And a lot of people have told me it's because I've always been myself. I've always wanted to let other people know that you can be a type of person who is Black, woman, Texan, American, you know, on the crew team. There's all these things, and I wanted to investigate how can we let people know on campus that you can be a regular person. You don't have to set people aside into standards of stereotypes, of brackets, and other types of things. So like, break yourself off from other people because of who they identify as. And it was really odd to me that smart as the students here are, they cannot understand the multivalent natures of people. They refuse to be able to allow that to happen in their heads. So I really wanted to be a part of this today because I hope that we can discuss how to move forward with that. Not necessarily because the people in here are already interested in doing that. I'm sure there's no one here who is not regularly doing that on a daily basis. No one here is not combating racism or feminism or any other type of issues that you come across, social issues. So my suggestion or my thoughts are, how can we as people who already do this, how can we motivate people who don't know a lot about these issues, who might be curious, who might not be curious, might not want to know that? How can we make them understand that we have to address these issues, that we have to address the issues of people being who they are while you are being who you are, and that not being an issue. So I hope that today, as we address all these institutional racism, these theories of institutional racism, and also the actualities of it, and activism on our campus, that we can move forward in this way. Thank you.
morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Waldo Johnson. I'm on the faculty at the School of Social Service Administration. In the spirit of transparency, I suppose, I'll say that I'm also an alum of the School of Social Service Administration. I'm teaching and a former director of the Race Center. So I've been asked, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for our first panel this morning. I'm going to ask those individuals to join me here at the front now. I'm going to ask each panelist to provide a brief introduction, indicating clearly who they are, their affiliation here with the university, and as a panelist, what they propose to bring to this discussion. We know that this particular discussion will be looking inwardly in terms of the University of Chicago as an institution and the ways in which it contributes or reproduces inequality, any range of difficulties. And we will have about a 35-minute discussion. Our trusty timekeeper here, Camille, will make sure that we stay on point with regard to our discussion. And then subsequent to our discussion among the panel, then we will open it up to the larger group here. Okay? Matt, you want to begin?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Matt Briones. I'm an associate professor of U.S. history, and maybe hoping not to be the model minority, not to be completely silent today, but I am more interested in hearing what the rest of the panel has to say and what the audience has to say. But I would only raise the issue that at least my own work, and then I think in terms of what I teach, I'm very much interested in thinking about interracial alliances and sort of helping to rewrite narratives of preconceived notions about how racialized groups interact with one another. So for me, I've written a book that that tries to rethink the relationship of Asian Americans and African Americans, so that these aren't always necessarily groups that are pitted against one another as model minority versus protest minority, but that actually, their histories show a deep sort of alliance and sympathy with one another and for one another. So I guess that's where I'd probably start. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Morning. Madam Greene. I'm an associate professor in the history in the college, and I'm also serving as the faculty chair for the Diversity Advisory Council that's been meeting for a year's time. It has approximately a year more of its term. We'll be issuing recommendations to the president and the provost in relation to diversity, inclusion, I would also say bias mitigation, problems related to intolerance, questions of belonging on campus. So in that sense, I'm very, very interested to be here during the day, hear what people want to share, learn more both about events that have happened in the near term, patterns that have emerged over the long term, and divisions and the suggestions that people have about where we might go as an institution, as a community, and I think as a partner in relation to the different communities that we find ourselves in here. I should also just add that I'm a historian specifically of African Americans in Chicago. There is certainly a lot to say in terms of thinking about the history of this city, as Professor Dawson shared, as someone who's grown up within this city. I'm actually not going to speak a lot about that in terms of my very brief remarks in relation to the start of this panel, but I look forward to seeing where conversations go in terms of thinking about the university's relationship with that history, that community, and those futures. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie Greene. I'm a third year in the college, English and press double major. I'm currently serving as president of the Organization of Black Students. So we were involved in leading the Zoo and Yale Solidarity event, and then also co-authored the petition that just came out with Muslim Student Association and Students for Justice in Palestine. So I can bring to this conversation kind of a bit of insight into student activism here and kind of conversations with administration and with other students on campus, and also just kind of generally student experiences.
Morning, my name is Linton. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in political science. I graduated from the college in 2011, so I've been here kind of continuously since 2007, which is a long time to be at the University of Chicago. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and I think I can share perspective of being an undergrad and grad student on campus, as well as someone whose family and personally engaged with the University of Chicago as a member of the Southside community, and how those types of engagements have changed over the years, and the push and pull and the frustration, long-term frustration in many cases, of what it's like to be engaging with the institution, but also what that struggle and that difficulty, and some positive, every sprinkled in, looks like from within. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Shae. I'm a second year in the college. I am the co-president of the African and Caribbean Students Association, and I also serve as the undergraduate liaison to the Board of Trustees. To bring to this conversation is mainly just my work with administration concerning African studies. This past autumn, I authored a case for African studies, which looked at the different ways the university does and does not support the study of the continent.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Johnaé. I'm also an undergraduate and graduate student from the University of Chicago. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I came here to study. And I was found in a precarious situation of being both a student and someone who identifies more with working class community. And so trying to find my footing, being on the south side of Chicago, but then also being in a very insulated community within the south side. And seeing the interplay between the institution and the community, and then some of the things I hope to bring are the ways that I was awakened, supported, and pushed into my own activism. And as I'm also the co-chair of the Chicago chapter of the Black Youth Project 100, which comes out of the institution of the University of Chicago, Professor Dr. Kathy Cohen. So I hope to share some kind of the lens of resistance and coming into activism, but then also some of the hurdles and obstacles, and hopefully to engage in a conversation of imaginative discourse about how we can move forward and break cycles.
Good morning. My name is Sara Zubi. I'm a second year in the college, majoring in public policy and Arabic. I'm a member of SJP, and I also helped co-author the statement with Stephanie and MSA and OBS. As for what I can bring to this panel, I can bring my unique experiences as a Palestinian on campus. I'm a huge minority here. There are like 5 of us. And how I've had to deal with harassment because of activism with the administration.
So one of the things that's very obvious, and even in your introductions, is the multiple ways in terms of identities that each of you have with the university. So with respect to issues around institutional racism and bias, I'm wondering if someone would like to begin in terms of kind of talking about some of your experiences personally, or those that you had with, know of that others have that you've witnessed.
So I guess I'll start on this conversation. I think on the topic of institutional racism, I think a lot of the issues I came across thus far are the traditional, it shouldn't be traditional, but students who do racist acts or say racist things. I've dealt with faculty, administration, that are more or less sometimes sympathetic to the issues I bring up, and other times not really sympathetic to the issues I bring up. I think the major contention I've had is I've met a lot of students who, for one reason or the other, had to take a leave of absence because they want to study the continent of Africa but have not been given the opportunity. And the opportunities that do exist are in locations they do not principally agree with. So, for example, the African Civilizations program is currently in Paris and not in the country, which has been a point of contention I've had with administration thus far. And speaking with students who've had to take a leave of absence or taken other means to study the continent of Africa, I think those are some of the issues I've personally come across. And also just being an African-American student, but also an African-American woman on this campus, has been very interesting. I think my contention kind of started during my prospect weekend, which is when you're already admitted into the college. They give you a chance to come and see what the university is about. I didn't really know there was an organization of Black students during my prospect weekend, or that there was an African and Caribbean Students Association. All I knew that there was this house called OMSA where minorities go. So that was pretty difficult for me, just because the amount of representation I saw on campus during my prospect weekend was very small, to the point that I remember going up to the administrator crying, and I was like, this is not the university for me. And then people always ask me, then why did you come here? And then I just remember my mom telling me, stop crying, the financial aid is really good.
So, in my experiences, institutional racism manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of the attention is oftentimes paid on kind of big external events that happen. And one of the big issues in my experiences since I thought about the University of Chicago back in 2006, without fail, almost on schedule, you can expect a major racial incident to happen somewhere on the campus. Every single year. If it's a ghetto party back in 2006, or if it's emails in 2016, that's 10 years, and without fail, it's expected. And it raises questions of what's being done to address these types of issues, and why do they persist? And why is it that certain students on campus, particularly students of color, feel isolated and in a bubble, and that we have to continue to justify our existence on campus, right? And that happens, outside the classroom, but inside the classroom, when you want to bring up and then try to engage a topic and bring up race, or bring up difference, or bring up marginalized communities, that there's a shock and a persistence that you just want to do the race thing, or your only contribution is to study race issues, or you're going to slow us down by trying to address topics that you can address in a different major, or a different space, or within a different community. And I think the way that I've kind of seen it, felt it, had my friends see it, feel it, have left the university because of it, is that there's nowhere on campus that, well, there are a few places on campus, but the predominant student experience, right? The life of the mind that we cherish so much, the warm extracurricular housing community where we're taught and told that we're family, that in all of those places, there's an othering that happens, and a repeated self-justification that I have to justify to you that these issues matter, or that the issues I've experienced happen, or that there's always a bit of skepticism. I think those types of experiences really taint and destroy what we're taught or told in prospect weekend, on admissions websites, of what this experience at the university is like. And it raises a great deal of frustration on why do we have the same experiences over and over again when you talk to students of color that have graduated from the campus that say, yeah, some things just don't change. When are we going to start to have those conversations to really address them? And I think that's kind of in my history, undergrad and graduate student history at the university.
Yeah, I would like to echo both of those, and I think that I could also go at length about parties around race or fetishization of Black women and Black bodies. But I think a part of the question of why they're not changing lies very much in the institution and why it keeps reoccurring. A lot of the consequences, if you want to call it that, or a lot of the actions following these incidents there is an apology, there is an email, there is a letter, there is a public forum, there is a committee. There are all these things that seek to, and I won't say if it's intentional or not. I don't think it's fair to do that. But I think that they say they seek to address the issue, but they don't gain much traction, and they don't really spur any kind of like real change. And so for me, over my 6 years being in the university and then coming out of it and still living in Chicago, I've really kind of made a pivot in my activism in terms of like trying to win hearts and minds, trying to get folks to understand why is this a question, why is this something that is important to me, and kind of have made the pivot to what are the real hardline policies that can actually be enacted to change the institution. And I'm definitely much more invested in that than in like the personal conversations. Now, to be clear, I think that interpersonal relationships are very important. I've had faculty members who have been very supportive of my my growing consciousness and my budding activism while I was on campus. I've had faculty who have had to resign because of their very blatant and transparent opposition to racism on campus. I've had students who were my peers and colleagues who, because we were invested in having relationships, and this is white and black, because we were invested in having these long-term relationships, that we were able to come to a point where there was some mirroring there, we were able to understand each other. So that piece I'm not trying to undermine, but I don't think that that's where the answer lies. I think that those people can be empowered to push the things that can create the change, but us talking amongst ourselves and to each other is not going to be the actual action of the change.
I think thinking about this from the standpoint of a faculty member, there are a range of ways in which the situation of faculty individually as individuals here, I think, has some protections that don't necessarily exist for students. So if I were to think about my own personal experience with encountering these things over the last 7 years that I've been here as a faculty member, I'd probably talk about a number of incidents of, I guess, what you could call white-splaining in relation to trying to sort of tell people basically, well, you know, this is really how the problem is framed, and this is the proper way to study it, and these are the people that represent the standards in the field, and so on and so forth. And that's off-putting, and I think that's symptomatic at times of some larger problems, which I think we'll have opportunity to get into as we go through the discussion. Particularly, I think, having to do with actually what the size is of the cohort of faculty that are here, and how that size of the faculty cohort has a number of different effects in terms of what kinds of courses can be mounted, in terms of what sorts of conversations take place, what kinds of advising resources are available for students, what kind of tone is set on campus in terms of talking about what truly is transformative knowledge, transformative research, transformative conversations, in terms of thinking about the kinds of communities that we live in. But I think that's something that we can get into a little bit deeper as the conversation progresses. Something that I feel very keenly as a faculty member in terms of my interactions with students and my sense of what the experience is for students here is that far too often, even when there are not overt acts of racism, intolerance, or bias, people are pushed and pressured in ways that force them to have to see themselves as isolated individuals, rather than as people who enjoy affinities, loyalties, commitments, responsibilities, in terms of who they feel that they're close to. I think that something for me, sort of sampling what's in the air right now as a result of the activism that has emerged over the last 2 years, as a historian of African Americans in Chicago and the United States, I absolutely feel that what we are in right now is a profound period of activation. And I think there are going to be significant challenges, significant transformations, significant struggles that are going to emerge out of it. One of the things that I've found most valuable in terms of this work is just the kind of tweeting and the messaging, to use a very sort of problematic word, the branding, that has come up around the notion that this activism allows people to be unapologetically Black, Palestinian, queer, trans, feminist, Latino. That mantra of being unapologetically something, which many, many people have adapted as a way of talking about what they're fighting for as much as what they are fighting against. I think that suggests something of a standard in relation to this campus, this institution, this community. Is it possible to study here, to develop, to commit yourself to various sorts of projects academically and still be apologetically blank in relation to the affiliations, the commitments, the loyalties, the responsibilities that you have? I know that both on this panel and through the day today, people are going to detail both personally and at an analytic level how that is, from their perspective, not possible right now at the University of Chicago. So I would suggest that one of the things that I'd like to see coming out of this, and one of the things that I'd like to join in, both in the work that I'm doing institutionally and just person to person, is how do we make this an environment where people don't feel like they have to check a portion of themselves in order to be here, but also not only not check that portion of themselves, but never have to apologize for it, never have to qualify, never have to say, well, I'm not going to put that in your face because I understand that's disruptive to you and a large number of people who somehow are made uncomfortable by that. We've got to figure out a way as a community and an institution to do a better job around that.
So these points are very powerful in terms of beginning this dialogue. And I'm aware, Matt, that you have some specific thoughts about faculty of color, as well as women, given that Adam talked a little bit about in some ways, some of the distinctions that faculty might enjoy or experience from the student experience. So perhaps you might want to weigh in here with your thoughts about those things as it relates to faculty.
Sure, I mean, thanks, Waldo. I mean, one of the things I emailed Waldo earlier about, and Adam and I are actually off with her suite mates, so we get to talk a little bit about these things on as well, but
We don't get to see each other enough.
yeah. My point was that, and I think it's not only true here, very true here, but across the nation, that you have women faculty of color who are spread so thin, in the sense that it's hard to say no when you're asked to do something, right? But because there's so few of us on campus anyways, you're asked to be on this board or this council, or trying to teach whatever you're trying to teach, trying to talk to graduate students, undergraduates, and then, my God, try to have kids and a marriage, right? So I think, it'd be nice to think much more structurally about what's wrong in terms of, whom have we hired? Is it just about tokenism, and are we really serious in ways that maybe some of our peer institutions at least are talking about? Are they able to walk the walk? I don't know, but why can't we make those same kinds of commitments that maybe Yale's making now, for example? And again, I'm not saying Yale's doing it very well, at least they're making pronouncements that they would. And then internally, I think it would be good for particularly faculty and the community to sort of take a look at itself too, because often I share these anecdotes with my students, but at least from my experience, not here, but at a previous institution, faculty of color can sometimes be their own worst enemies. There can be crabs in a barrel, and so person, right? That in some ways I found that faculty of color have been the biggest hurdles to advancing, because they have a particular kind of corner, and they don't like that you might be on that corner, and so they're speaking out of both sides of their mouths, so that they say they want to have be as supportive as possible. And yet, I've experienced just the opposite. And this is not actually even interracial, so to speak. It was actually within an Asian American unit. So these were Asian Americans, sort of going at each other. And instead of being able to say we can mentor one another and we can work collaboratively, all of a sudden it became about, well, I'm the only one who's supposed to represent, you can be here. So in terms of looking internally and being self-critical about what we can do.
So we've had an opportunity to talk a little bit about the institutional experiences as we are experiencing it here on the campus, but we also know that the University of Chicago looms large in the city and stuff. And so I'm wondering if there are those of you who would like to weigh in to talk a little bit about kind of community experiences with the university, either personally or the ways in which you've come to kind of recognize the way in which the university reproduces various forms of injustice, contributes to a lack of diversity, and how that then impacts not only the neighborhoods that are surrounding the University of Chicago, but because of its influence in the city, how does that impact, in some ways, the larger city of Chicago?
I can say, for me, in my personal experience, like I said, I was kind of treading this line of being in the institution, but not really identifying or finding community in the college or grad school, for that matter. And so I live over on 60th and Prairie. And it was very odd to me that not only were there like 4 Chicago Police Department cars always on the corners of my apartment, but there started to be, and this is more like into my grad school years, so within the last 3 to 4 years, UCPD cars patrolling. And I just found that very odd. And then as I started to like kind of think on it and meditate on it, I understood that as the university pushes into Woodlawn and encroaches on public property and privatizes it, that they have a stake in this community now, whether it is a positive stake, I beg to differ with that, but this is now a part of their territory. And it felt very odd. And I won't even say it felt odd, it felt wrong. It felt wrong, and it made me very angry, and it made me feel unsafe. And I shouldn't have to feel unsafe, not only just because of the political and racial part, but because I have University of Chicago like pins and hoodies and shirts, and I walk out of my apartment and I feel unsafe because I see this UCPD vehicle like just patrolling. So that's just like a personal anecdote. But then to further that, I think it's very important, and I'm very appreciative that it's been lifted up, that the identity of Black women on this campus is a very particular and unique experience as well. And I think that just needs to be said. A lot of my close friends, so when I talk about my awakening and my budding activism, it was because I met some really beautiful people who make up Fearless Leading by the Youth, Fly. And I met them when I came here in 2008. And I remember it was my first experience door knocking. They were just like, yeah, come on, let's go. It was, no pretense or anything like that. And I remember being a student and like I said about the forums, seeing the forums about, okay, this is the Trauma Center campaign, what should we do about it? And that was even pushed by students, right? Push the universities to have a forum. So I don't want to minimize it anyway. But seeing those forums, but then also seeing like the very courageous and unapologetic acts of the members of FLY, and seeing that they were here for this long term now, it's been 5 years and they've actually made a win. It's just, I was with Veronica, who's one of the members, like just this past Sunday, and BYP 100 still has this tie to the university because of how it started. And so we have meetings on university campus at times, and I was at a meeting and Veronica hit me up. She lives in the area, and we were supposed to go see, Beyonce's halftime show. But she was trying to like get in touch with me so we could go watch it. And I was like, yeah, just come to such and such, I'm over here. And she's like, oh girl, I can't come over there, I'm banned. And it's just like, wow. So.
Others?
So I guess there's two stories that I can think of immediately. One is this feeling of inclusiveness on and around campus, and the push and pull, and one of the big conversations about the role of the police, right? And part of the narrative that was quite frankly very offensive growing up on the south side of Chicago and coming to the University of Chicago was the understanding of where the university is and how the surrounding neighborhood is discussed. And that's not just a conversation that is happening internally, but that's something that people in the surrounding neighborhoods also hear. And in that type of conversation of, hey, you know, you're on the south side of Chicago, I know you've been watching the news, you need to stay within these parameters, don't go too far south, even though the city is a giant place with incredible cultural institutions, restaurants, people, places to go see. You can't go south of 61st because you never know, it's the Wild West. But that type of conversation, along with the idea of students or community members wanting police to feel safe, it's the question of who are you feeling safe from, and the idea that the university is in fact a bubble, and historically has been a bubble around communities of color, predominantly African American communities, that it has brushed up against back and forth over time. But that conversation then changes the willingness to come to not just the university, but to be in Hyde Park, right? The conversation of Hyde Park being a diverse neighborhood is very, very shaky when you look at where people are going. So you may have on the numbers a lot of different racial communities interacting, but are they interacting in the same spaces? Are they being engaged with in the same way by the institutions around them? And obviously the answer is no, right? And the second story is just looking at colleges. I was quite thankful and fortunate to be a part of the Collegiate Scholars Program, which works with Chicago public school students, engaging them in classes here over the summer while in high school. But one of the more frustrating things was being at Morgan Park High School in the South Side, being an IB International Baccalaureate student, and for college fairs and college days, Harvard's coming, Stanford's coming, Northwestern sent people down there, Oxford sent some folks over, and the University of Chicago said no one. No banner, no voter, no representative, no one. Right? When we did work at Hyde Park Academy, in 2008, 2009, many of the students and families didn't think the University of Chicago was a place for them, didn't know it was a world-class academic institution, thought of it just as a hospital, and furthermore thought of it as a hospital that's not for them. It's an institution that's not for them, that there's no engagement there. And so I've been happy to see, while I've been here, a different push and a different emphasis towards reaching out to those communities with talented, bright students, saying that this is a place that they can go to. But again, it's that idea that in the mid-2000s, and quite frankly today, there are a number of people that look like many of the people on this panel, and the folks in this room, that's different than what the campus looks like, that are not being engaged and thought of and being, courted like they would other places from around the world, or quite frankly, different neighborhoods in the same city, right? And I think those types of experiences shape the way the university, not just in its economic decisions, not just in its expansion, but valuing of people and valuing of communities and how those ideas are recreated among students so that students don't engage. That kind of stuff is very destructive, and it continues to maintain an adversarial relationship. So things have gotten better, and that's great because the bar is quite low. Great, progress is happening. But we have to be sure that we're thinking about not just the student experience, but institutionally and engaging with how it polices, where its schools are, and who's being welcomed to the neighborhood, both as someone that wants to have fun on a Saturday evening, but also someone that wants to go to college and go and experience this great place that we talk about, we speak about to others.
Adam?
So this question touches, I think, directly on the history of the university, not just the history of the university sort of seen by us in the room or by others, or even by the community, but also the history that the university generates internally and understands about itself. On the one hand, I think it's important to acknowledge that the university had openings in relation to people to study at the highest level and move on to positions of consequential leadership. People like Monroe Work, who did most of the empirical research out of Tuskegee that documented lynching, received his PhD in the first decade of the century here. Benjamin Mays, who mentored people from Martin Luther King to Lerone Bennett and others at Morehouse, received his doctorate in divinity here. Many, many people, and this is something, of course, we're familiar with over the last 10 years, that the university has kind of recited almost as a sort of canonical statement about the ways in which it's committed to these ideals of diversity. At the same time, the university wrote amicus briefs in favor of maintaining restrictive covenants in the 1940s, and the university instituted the Southeast Chicago Commission that established not just a bubble, but a fortified bubble in relation to the idea that you had to establish hard perimeters that kept a community that was becoming increasingly black, and because of the ways in which the economy was transforming, increasingly poor, away from the sort of daily life of the university. And there are pieces that in my Black Chicago class that we've read at times, read by Gwendolyn Brooks, about the experience as a black person having difficulty in terms of being able to go on the campus in the same sort of way, Johnaé, that you were talking about, your friend over from Fly and others not being able to come on because of the ban. This is something that's happened for a long time. I guess what I would want to suggest as part of the conversation is that we push very hard to draw distinctions between the ways in which the university understands interests in relation to the community, the ways in which the university understands engagement in relation to the community, and the ways in which the university acknowledges responsibility in relation to the community. The first two are ones that I think are followed as a rule by the ways in which the University of Chicago has gone. In fact, the reason why it moved forward with that sense of pursuing a brief on behalf of supporting restrictive covenants is that they were concerned about what radical shift, radical tipping, which was a reality in relation to neighborhood conversion in Chicago over the period of the middle of the 20th century, what that would do to the university. And indeed, I think there was a back pocket plan potentially to move to Oak Park, to move to Palo Alto, to move someplace, any place, but a Chicago that was transitioning as dramatically as it did, which might well have happened if there had not been the kind of quote-unquote stabilization of the community around Hyde Park. But we're at a point now where I think we have to push people very hard to recognize that engagement is not the same thing as accountability. When I think about the range of programs, Tamara Johnson, Bill McDade, a number of people have been, I think, very, very intrepid and have done tremendous work in terms of drawing together a sense of what the programs are that people are engaged with in terms of community engagement at this university. And I recall as part of the work of our council going over those programs and just getting a sense of how they were operating. I think 1, 2, 3 maybe had a feedback loop similar to the one that BYP had at the start that eventually became BYP 100, where people who were involved in the organization were actually invited to speak back to the university and say, is this working for you? Is this actually something that's valuable? Is this something that is helping in relation to the general well-being of this community? There are enrichment, tutorial, all sorts of programs that do not have those mechanisms. And there are reasons why people wouldn't implement them in. That's additional work in relation to doing that kind of work. But we as a university could, if we chose to, if we valued it, we could say that that's something that's mandatory in relation to putting on programs where you're engaged with the community. We need to hear from the community about whether or not that's something that adds value to people's experiences. That in terms of thinking about what kinds of things work, you sit down beforehand and say to people, well, what is it that you know that you need? And I think that's been a tremendous lesson out of the trauma center struggle, was the way in which that had to do with the university being wrenched into a position where it acknowledged that the medical priorities of the community were something that could potentially transform the ways in which the university understood its own priorities in relation to hospital operation. So one of the things that I would suggest in terms of, not only cataloging, although it's important to catalog this because it's precisely the ways in which the university establishes a record and a history and a tradition of diversity that often erases the fact that these other kinds of episodes, like for instance its position on restrictive covenants, are not also part of the history. But one way I think to kind of push people to open this out and recognize that they need to do this differently is to say engagement is not the same thing as accountability. And if you want to be a neighbor, if you want to be a partner, if you want to be part of a better Chicago, you have to find a way to make yourself accountable to a community as well as engaged with it.
So Sara, I'm going to, before we open this up to the larger group, ask if you might share some of your experiences as a student here, particularly as a Palestinian student, because I think this will also enable us to move this discussion in some ways to perhaps a more global perspective, given I know much of your activism as a student is not separate from some of the kind of global activism you are either engaged in or get forced into because of that identity.
Yeah, so being a Palestinian student here is very challenging. Even from the first couple quarters, I wasn't even involved in SJP yet, but I had already experienced anti-Palestinian sentiment with jokes that from my friends that Palestine doesn't exist and that I'm actually Israeli, not Palestinian. And it wasn't until my spring quarter that I actually got harassed or threatened by someone who lived in my house for my activism because apparently we had had discussions that I wasn't going to continue it. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was when I talked to administration about it and I was told that maybe he didn't know better. Maybe his parents didn't teach him not to say Happy Nakba Day or you're a despicable excuse for a human being. And when we talked with administration again about the AEPI leaked emails, I found them also defending these racist, horrid statements against Palestinians, against Muslims, against African Americans, against women, that this is free speech and this is not hate speech. And because it's free speech, they're not going to really do anything about it. So it's hard. It's really hard to experience all the racism and hate and not have the university care or do anything about it on an administrative level. It makes activism really hard. It pushes me towards being silent, which I know I shouldn't, because I'm really terrified of conflict. So, yeah.
So before, as we now move to open this up to conversation between the panelists and the larger group here, I just wanted to take a minute to go over a couple of things that we talked about so far, or at least what might be viewed as some of the themes that. So one being, and that was particularly articulated by Shae, that we might identify as this colonial perspective that the university takes with respect to the study of Africa, and how this makes that study not only very narrowly focused, but very difficult, for individuals who might choose to do so. The issue around climate is very interesting that at this particular moment, we're engaged in developing climate surveys, but as Alan kind of points out, just during his, say, 10-year year at the university as an undergraduate student. Make it clear that not working toward one. 3 degrees. climate issue is one that we see at all levels, at the student level, at the faculty level, at the administrative level, at the, that it is very much ingrained, and in many ways it seems to these particular levels and the way in which this climate issue immerses, it reinforces and continues in ways that it ends up, as was suggested by someone observing it, that it ends up being in many instances in response, an apologist response, where simply words are offered, but little in terms of action that does not require a great deal of physical and kind of psychological push and motion on people who are already finding themselves with multiple identities, which in many ways further contributes to the alienation of an individual being able to really succeed perhaps in ways that perhaps sometimes even as students, our peers might be doing, as faculty, as our faculty peers might be doing because of our marginalized, racialized, and various other diminished identities. But at the same time, we're expected to be a part of this larger environment and seeing its races. So with that, I'm going to now open it up to questions from the audience, and ideally there'll be questions and
not statements.
So my name is James Harris. I'm a relatively new administrator here at the University of Chicago. I'm the Director of Change Management for administration here. Joining the organization in September, it's been very interesting to sort of see the dynamics between faculty, students, and staff here. And one of the things that I've observed at the table is that, I've been listening to your very compelling comments around this issue from a faculty and from a staff standpoint, but I don't see any staff up there, which I think is very interesting. The question that I have is, in your experiences here, you guys have a very rich history here, what have been the efforts to align faculty, students, and staff around addressing this issue, and what has been that experience as you attempted to do so?
I remember last year there was, I think there were budget cuts, and the university was planning to lay off lots of staff members. So that was when students and staff kind of came together. I don't really know of anything where all three of these communities came together to kind of stand in solidarity with one another. But last year there was a sit-in in the admissions office. I had some graduating seniors who were literally risking kind of being able to walk across the stage in an effort to kind of bring attention to the fact that lots of already kind of poorly treated staff members here were going to lose their jobs.
There have been, I'll just say, during my tenure here, and even longer than out, there have been, at one point, there were at least some social activities that were designed to bring together faculty, staff, and perhaps graduate students. And I remember they occurred for maybe 3-4 years, maybe a little bit longer. I can't remember what actually happened that led to the dissolution of it. But as a result of that, I know that there were some individual instances where people were able to connect across, various youth, if you were to think about it, because I agree with you. Perhaps another missing component also would be alum. That because my experience has been that once people leave here with a degree, they're gone. They're out the door. They show up, in some of the most interesting places, and they may very well choose to, in some ways, in private, acknowledge. They'll often say that they had, at minimum, a very alienating experience here, and often, and in large measure, I'm talking about alums of color. So it's another way, I think, in which the physical structure of this university, which is, in comparison, fairly small, operates in ways that, in many ways, does not promote integration seamlessly across these districts.
So it's hard to bring all of these different groups together. Partly it's hard because the university could do a much, much better job of valuing what comes out of people being able to come together and talk in relation to this group. I go back to my unapologetically blank start in terms of my comments. If that were more the standard here, then I think people would feel more support, more value, more acknowledgement of what it means to have those conversations. So that's a tone thing, and that's a climate thing that I think partly has to do with establishing priorities. Speaking as a faculty person, there are ways in which doing this brings one up very quickly against the kind of double bind that one faces as a faculty member. There are great privileges. There's what appears to be a tremendous amount of freedom as an individual, as opposed to somebody engaged within a group that comes to being part of a faculty member here. But the precious commodity is time, always. And so, for instance, Shae's been very kind on this panel not to call me out for having missed 2 meetings that we were supposed to have in the last couple of months to talk about these issues in relation to the council. And, I've got an excuse in relation to having an infant daughter that was sick that I had to be home at, and so on and so forth. But what this really brings up is that time makes it very, very difficult for us to build those sorts of relationships. And time is a structural condition in terms of being a faculty person or being a student. But if there was more facilitation in terms of encouraging creating the spaces in which that could happen, Tamara's blowing up my phone all the time about what's happening in relation to students and so on and so forth, which I'm incredibly grateful for. There should be 10 Tamaras, and there should be more than 10 Adams and Matthews and Waldos and Michaels and others who are faculty members here, Kathy Cohen's, in order to be able to make it possible for there to be a little bit more engagement with students, or a lot more engagement with students, a little bit more engagement outside of the point of, the office talking about a BA project or a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation, but just simply sitting down and talking about what's the experience of being here? What are you trying to do in relation to the stuff that you're working on? What is, the research that you're doing, what does it have to do with the ways in which people might think about their lives and their interests? There's very little time to be able to do that. There could be ways that the university could make that devotion towards those kinds of activities more of a value that would mean that people would invest their time in that. Saying, for instance, that kind of work is understood as an important metric in terms of thinking about promotion and tenure. Trying to hire people who actually are adept at that kind of work, as opposed to mansplaining or white-splaining or straight-splaining their way around how they think about different disciplines. But that, I think, is symptomatic of the ways in which the university values individuals over groups, and the ways in which the university puts pressure on all layers of people who work here to produce, and usually produce in a way that's strictly and solely academic.
If there was a little bit of a different paradigm in terms of how people thought about the value of the kind of community that we have here, I think those kinds of interactions would be a lot more possible.
Michael, you wanted to weigh in?
Well, I have a question.
Oh, your question.
Yeah, it took a while to figure out how to turn this into a question and not a statement. But the question is, I was really struck by the comments that Sara made, Johnaé made, and Alan made. How do we think about free speech and how it's used on one hand to silence activists, on the other hand to protect racists? And that leads to the situation that Alan described of racist incidents every year. How do we deal with such free speech as fetishized on this campus in a way that's very detrimental to the purposes that we're talking about today?
I have a direct thought on that, but I don't want to get into that. I get along.
I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is if we're serious about the academic inquiry, and if we're serious about challenging the ideas and the theories of what underpins everything that we do, if we're true to that, oh my goodness, if we're true to that commitment, then I think it should be a campus conversation. I think it's a classroom conversation that we really need to seriously have instead of using free speech, a value that I hold dearly, basically as a prop to not have difficult conversations or to take action that may offend some people, right? And so right now we're in this kind of back and forth, to your point, as I understand it. Something happens, we get an email from administrative kind of office saying, that's not the best thing to happen, but we're in a box, you know, you have to just live within confines, but there are a few places on campus that I see that are willing to have the conversation, and the places that have those conversations on campus tend to be of people that are being hurt by the language being used. And so if we keep on, again, going back to isolating students of color, it is your responsibility alone to fight the institution and to try to address, put them in boxes that they have to, you know, adjust or reevaluate at a baseline. What the heck's happening around here? We're not going to have substantive conversation or transfer of ideas that we allege to have in these other places. It's why you come to the University of Chicago, according to my nice fancy pamphlet. We're not going to move on this issue. And so I don't have a singular idea in particular, but I know we need to start having those conversations and not put the burden on students of color or communities that are hurt over and over again and are alienated over and over again to have those conversations in isolation away from other people because they are difficult or challenging or hard, right? This is a place of, you know, rigorous inquiry. That's what we run around and say all the time. If that's the case, this should be like no other topic that should come under scrutiny, that should have diverse ideas and perspectives brought to the forefront, and that needs to happen in, you know, the classroom as well as on campus around and encouraging, to your point, Adam, having these conversations more often and being an institutional priority to get people talking and engaging and thinking about what we need to do.
Sara, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add that, so last year I was part of this new program called Leaders of Color, and it was obviously just for students of color where we had conversations about privilege and about things we weren't comfortable talking about in front of white people. And I think that's says something about the climate of speech on campus, that non-students of color have no problem discriminating and being racist in public spaces, but students of color can't talk about privilege among their peers because they're afraid to offend. And so the burden of deciding what to say and what is free speech and being comfortable using free speech, that doesn't exist for the students of color here. And the university doesn't realize that by allowing anything to be free speech, that they're actually silencing a lot of students of color.
While I was on campus, there was the Emerging Minds Project, which was started off as, it sounds similar to what you were experiencing as well. And it was at, I don't think it's called OMSA anymore, is it? It is? It's called OMSA? Okay. And so these conversations were addressing like the different isms and privilege. And then it kind of got expanded to a cohort structure where folks were actually tasked to really wrestle with these things over a long period of time with the same group of folks. And I don't see why it wouldn't be a thing for us to make that an actual course and not just a course for students of color. I think that I definitely believe and understand the power of caucus work. So like folks of color, even within folks of color, Black people, as their own type of caucus. I think that's something we haven't talked about here, and it's very large to talk about right now, but just anti-Blackness even within people of color, as it kind of trickles down from being in the framework of white supremacy. I mean, these are other things that have to kind of be, confronted. But I think that if that were a course that could be an actual course that everyone has to take, just like I had to swim, how many is it before I could graduate, which was pretty hard for me. But just like we can have these other arbitrary things that we still hold on to that we have to do before we graduate, I don't see why confronting these things wouldn't be something that you would have to do before you graduate. And I think oftentimes it's difficult because that's really the transformative work. The transformative work is not necessarily being in relationship and talking about things with each other. Oftentimes the hardest work is the self-work to actually confront within ourselves our own biases, our own racism, and to really look at that and kind of like sit with that and do the slow process of trying to heal from that. And I think that is kind of preferred to have conversations about the contemporary Black books or authors, and to read in a study group and feel that we're being edified. But if we're not really having that within the context of our experience and our history and our placement within this cycle of these incidents, then it's kind of really just making us feel good. And the work doesn't feel good. It's not. It's very ugly.
Just really quick point. There was an editorial after the stories about A by Lambda chapter broke in the Maroon. Just want to cite the person who wrote it, Sara Zimmerman, that pointed out that the response, the official response within the university from the vice president of campus student life, the university dean of students, acknowledged on the one hand that the speech was offensive and the speech had also done harm. That came out of the various emails. And that's actually very, very significant in terms of the university's policy on free speech. By name, a speech objectionable, problematic, difficult, even deeply offensive, I think is the quotation, is protected. Jeff Stone, I've had an opportunity to talk with him a couple of times about this. I imagine that we're going to have more opportunities to talk about this within the council. Deeply offensive speech is protected, according to the code of the university right now. At the same time, the statement by those two administrators acknowledged that this offensive speech did harm. Right now then, what we have at a kind of simple sort of, running of the formula is that it is possible for speech to simultaneously be harmful on this campus and yet be protected. And I've brought this up a few different times now over the past week to several people, including a few that were part of the committee that drafted that statement, which we have to acknowledge now is not only very firmly held by the university, but is held by a number of other universities now increasingly across the country. It's been seen as a model in relation to thinking about the protection of free speech. We as a university, therefore, now are in a position where we cannot protect students from harm being done by speech that is protected by the letter of our policies. We have to figure that out, clearly. And I think that one of the things that may start us towards figuring that out, which I know that a range of students, Sara, Stephanie, and others have really kind of brought to the forefront over the last week, is putting that in front of the university and saying that's a contradiction. That not only is a contradiction in terms of how people feel, but that's a contradiction in terms of whether or not people are able to study
whether people are able to feel like they belong on the campus, able to function. And those are also core responsibilities, core commitments on the part of the university in terms of what it understands its main work to be. So that problem's got to be solved. It's got to be stated plainly, and then people have to figure out how to solve it.
Hi. My name is Francie Russell. I'm a grad student in philosophy, and I'm the diversity outreach coordinator for philosophy. It's the least diverse of all the humanities. So I have two quick questions. One is a bit about policy and legalities, and one is for the students. So the question about policy and legalities is, and maybe Adam Greene can answer this, what is the university's policy about hiring and pursuing hiring faculty of color and women? I've heard very mixed things about it in terms of what's legal and what's not, so I'd love to hear about that. And then in terms of the students, I wondered if you had thoughts about undergrad, grad student alliances and how the relationships between undergrads and grads are different than undergrad and faculty, how those relationships have been helpful or hurtful to you. So I'd just like to hear more about what you see as possibilities there.
So I'll just punt a bit because in fact the issue is very confused and there are a number of policies that are contradictory in terms of what it means to make outreach efforts versus what are the legal requirements of a search that can withstand a challenge in relation to a candidate that feels that they were excluded somehow, either minority or majority. We know obviously from the kind of history that goes on within the Supreme Court that there are many instances in which these processes are sued from a majority standpoint. I would certainly ask either Tamara or Matthew Christian from the Provost's office, Deputy Provost, to correct me on this, but searches on the one hand can engage in outreach, but cannot at this point pursue some sort of targeted construction of the search, some kind of preference that's stated up front in terms of locating faculties, unless the search itself is defined in such a way that it would orient itself towards that group. Even then, you can't use race, gender, sexuality, SES as a criteria specifically for the kinds of candidates that are there. I mean, it raises some interesting issues because there are many, many sectors of American life, from coaching professional sports teams to working in Silicon Valley, where the so-called Rooney Rule is something that is regularly followed. As I understand it, this is something that's verboten in higher education. But my sense is actually there might be more of a conversation about how it is that those practices can operate in those sectors of employment, but can't operate within a university. So not that you would make a search entirely a group of people that are underrepresented minority or coming from an SES background or other sorts of markers of identity, but you might say that your search needs to have at least one person who somehow goes in this direction. Again, this is something that most universities, if not all universities, that I'm familiar with that moved away from. It does exist in other sectors of society. I think, though, that there's also, besides the legality, I think it's important to recognize legality in terms of what the restrictions are that people feel that they have to work around, but then also the way in which the legality incentivizes people to make token gestures and appear to have made a very, very sort of modest effort to move in a particular direction, but not have a more robust process because, well, the law won't sort of uphold us in terms of those efforts. And that's something that I feel I see in the departments that I'm familiar with in terms of the justifications that they provide for the ways in which they pursue searches. So at the same time we think about what we're committed to in relation to the law, I think we also have to think about how the law allows us to create workarounds to say, well, we did our best, but we couldn't come up with somebody, and really interrogate whether or not that represents a good faith effort.
Just to touch a little bit on that point also, I think a point of contention in my article, Case for African Studies, is that I made the claim that we should hire more African professors to be teaching things related to African studies. And I think one thing that I've been learning a lot recently was speaking with faculty and administration, and especially one thing I've learned, just to do a little shout out to Dr. Cohen and her African American politics class, is that there's a difference between descriptive representation and substantive representation. So I've had administrators and faculty who identify as African American but substantively have not been supportive. And I've also had faculty and administration who identify as white American and been completely supportive, people that I can call it odd hours at night and say, this is what I'm going through and this is how I'm dealing with different things. So I think when it comes to the hiring process, I think I'm more so interested now in substantively representing not only the subject materials, but also the students that will be taking these courses. Now talking about undergraduate, graduate relations, I know Alan's one person I personally talked to. Other graduate students have been very helpful in not only talking about the undergraduate experience, but how what we're learning in undergrad will transcend into the graduate school experience. And I think OMSA, or CII, sorry, CII has also been very helpful in making the connection between undergraduate and graduate students much, much stronger. But I would also say it's very difficult, quite frankly. I know there are a lot of graduate students that study in the continent, which are very helpful. And, you know, when there's not like an undergraduate major and things of that sort, graduate students are my only option, quite frankly. So I think it's in my particular case, I think it's very helpful to have graduate students to be able to talk to.
There's someone against the wall that has had a long-standing question.
My background, my children attended Morgan Park Academy right down the street from you, Alan. And oh, by the way, Chicago didn't go there either for admissions. But, which was a multicultural school, and we all learned about each other through meals. So we had international meals, we mixed, we brought our foods, we brought our heritage, we brought our history. So I asked the members of the panel, do you think that would be effective in sort of breaking down barriers?
I think if the dinner also includes very substantive conversations around how folks' privilege or identity or intersection of identities are creating harm and also creating opportunities to address harm, I think yeah. But I think that oftentimes when I've been in institutions, whether it be the university or the public school that I teach at, the first step, like one of the ideas is like, okay, well, let's just exchange our kind of like our foods and our clothes, our dress. And at that point you have to ask yourself, is me eating this food asking me to think about the person that prepared this food, to think about the history of us not as individuals, but how we've come to this space to eat this meal. So context, like having contextualized discussion around the meal, certainly. I mean, I think you can do that over pizza as well as you could do that over another cultural meal. I think it's really what's happening at the table is what's important.
I just say as my little hobby horse, but I'm the new, basically, director of undergraduate studies for history. And it goes back to something Adam was saying in terms of the structure that, you know, the college is saying one thing, or the university is saying one thing about putting the emphasis on the undergraduates. But I'll be honest, like, just knowing what, my budget is for this year, I mean, I've had to scrape for any bit of money I could get just so that I could have food for some of my undergraduates who are coming to these, events. And most of the time I don't. I mean, I know that's the best way to get undergraduates there. But if I wanted to have an event where I could, talk about, of course, we could talk about history of race relations in the United States, I can't do it. I've got to choose that over, having a reception for the graduating fourth years and their parents. It's such a small, for all the money we have, there's so little that's being apportioned to, to college students.
I think just one of those last 2 points. I think it's a great idea, and I wish there were greater resources for it. Again, I think it goes back to making sure that we don't get into a situation, while it's important that we're not just talking to ourselves, right? So there's a lot of programming that happens out of OMSA, 710, CII, and the big cluster that is always trying to reach out to other audiences, new audiences, people that are reaching out, trying to reach out all the time. And the folks that actually come to the great conversations that they have, the speakers, the student interactions, tend to be the same folks over and over again. And so one of the things that comes up with an idea like this is, where are students going to for advice, or who has credibility or persuasive power on this campus? For a lot of students, it's an RH, or their RA, or the resident master. For some, it's faculty members, right? If you have those kinds of folks saying it's important to go to this conversation, because in the same ways that you over dinner will talk about the 2016 election or sports or halftime shows or something, that these are conversations that are also important. So it's not just putting on the event. I think there are great events that happen. I think this is something we should try, but it's getting kind of a holistic approach to getting as many different people as possible to these events, so these types of conversations can happen, and breaking down the barrier of, you're not going to come into this room and get yelled at, right? These are tough conversations, but they're you talk about Marx, Hegel, and Sartre, you have tough conversations all the time, right? In the classes that you have otherwise. So I think that would be the other key component, that the conversations are great, but making sure that we're reaching out to as many folks as possible to try to be a part of those conversations.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So if we can get to maybe 1, 2 more questions, you can be succinct with your question, and I'll ask the panelists to keep their responses somewhat succinct as well. Okay?
Can you take 3 questions before you hear?
Okay, we can take 3.
Okay, I'll make mine a comment then rather than a question, and that is building on the answer to this very last question and the very first question over here. I see we're talking a lot about including more people from within the university community, faculty, staff, administration. The notice I received of this meeting, I'm a member of the community. I'm not faculty, staff, or administration. Even though I am an alumna, I had to receive this third hand. And I'm disturbed to find that even though the invitation clearly said it was for students, faculty, and administration, and community, that you all seem to be operating still in a bubble of, an on-campus bubble, which is broader than the other bubbles some of you operate within, but still a bubble. Johnaé brought up some things that were happening in the community, and some of the others of you did. I know there's been some interaction between students, like Students for Health Equity and FLY, which the university still has not acknowledged as the major factor in its change on the trauma center. But I just wanted to point out that the community is, again, being left out of the conversation here, especially simply by having this meeting held on a weekday when people under 65 are generally at work.
Hi there. I'm an undergraduate student here, and I had a question for some of the undergraduate students here, and I guess graduate students as well. There was a comment about how faculty felt, or specifically faculty of color, felt like they were being spread thin going to all of these different events, and I wanted to know, from a student's perspective, how is it trying to, I guess, balance all of the different demands on your time, both within school, wanting to be in different clubs, being on the crew team or something like that, and also trying to represent yourself and people of color generally?
Yeah, so...
Got one more question.
Oh, okay.
The comments, excuse me, the comments earlier about needing to change the structure, institutional systems of oppression, and making opportunities for these kinds of discussions, along with discussions of money and funding, made me start to think about follow the money, and you often find the power. And so I'm wondering, do we know about the Board of Trustees, and are they at all looped into this conversation in any way at the university, and are they taking any role
Okay, so to answer your question about student kind of leaders on campus, I'll say that like this week, like I'm in Dawson, right? Like I literally like forgot to go to a discussion section where we had to meet with like Karen or College about the API, right? Like there are things that are like that it's like hard to like balance everything because it's like, okay, like do I miss my discussion or do I go to this meeting? And then it's kind of like when you go to the meeting, right? Because I have like 110 students in this organization who are relying on me to do something, right? So like we're often put in situations where it's like, what takes precedence, and how do we like decide what takes precedence, right? So it's like the week before, it was like we had to draft a decision, and I was like, I have this paper in my book that I haven't read, and the paper's due tomorrow, so it's like, what do I do? So like often in the same way that I think that like faculty members feel pretty like spread thin if you happen to be like one of the student leaders of a particularly a minority student group, right? Like the organization of Black students is called on again and again and again by other student organizations, by administration, by faculty members, like, and it's just like it just keeps going, right? And of course I'm very happy to sit on the panel, but I'm also like there was a fundraiser for OBS last night and I didn't go to bed till 2 and then I woke up and came here, like, so it's like it's hard, right? And I wrote. Right? So that's cool. But it's like all these things where it's like I'm not just the president of the organization of Black students, right? Like I'm also a student and I row and I play rugby and I do all these other things. And it's really hard to decide like who I am today, and who's gonna get me today and all these things.
So going along that note, I do agree, it's very time consuming. Sometimes I just really wonder, like, what do non-people of color, like, think about? I spend so much time, like, consumed by, I mean, to be honest, I just spend so much time consumed by issues regarding my identity and things I want to study and things of that sort. I spend a lot of time in meetings with administrators, with faculty, with other students, now because of all the different positions I have. Quite frankly, University of Chicago is expensive, so I still have to work. I still have to be a student, full-time student at that. You know, if I want to go to graduate school, I still have to do research. So there's all these different factors that I spend my time in a 1-hour meeting talking about different things while my other counterparts are filling out internship applications. So it's just very, it's very hard to balance self-care to say like, okay, this is the things I want to do, but at the same time knowing that there's a greater issue that I'm concerned about that I know won't be figured out in my time here, or even by the time I'm finished with my PhD, or you know, things of that sort. So just moving forward and knowing that some of the things that I'm working on, quite frankly, are going to have to be put on hold, so that not only I can thrive academically and give back as an alumna, hopefully, to actually, you know, put forth and say these are things that I'm concerned about, but at the same time, like as a student, you know, I still have to worry about my future also. In relation to the Board of Trustees question, I think the Board of Undergraduate Liaison position is very interesting. I think one thing I should note is that there are 55 trustees on the board, but I have access to the trustees that sit on the committee for campus and student life, which is about 12 to 13 trustees. So that isn't the full board. One thing I can tell you is when meeting with administrators, they, how can I say this? Well, one thing I can say is that, okay, so we all have access to newspapers. Quite frankly, they read the Maroon. A lot of people have read what I published thus far. And I think they are aware in the sense that trustees can easily just go in the Maroon and know what's happening. When it comes to communicating with trustees, I should acknowledge that we do host luncheons between one individual trustee and undergraduate and graduate students that they have access to. But quite frankly, it's a very complicated relationship right now. One thing I can say is that even within the Board of Trustees, I think there's about 3 or 4 people that identify as African American on the board. So I mean, a lot of it is how many trustees actually have executive powers to say if we want to have something happen, this is going to happen. How many of them are more so within committees saying that, this is how the university should be run. So that's my perspective. And one thing I should also say, since we're about to round up, is that you guys can always email me with more questions. I don't know if our email addresses are up there, but I do know there have been people around campus that have reached out to me about the different issues that I've been advocating for. And it's just nice to be able to talk to people. And I know we all on the board say that we're super busy, but one thing we're never too busy for is talking with people about the different issues that we're working on, so that the burden isn't only on us, and it can be on other people also.
Excuse me. So as we close this out, I'll try to respond somewhat to the first question that was raised about the community. This particular event, as we indicated at the very beginning, we view as the beginning of a series of events that will address these issues. But with respect to the timing and the scheduling of this event, it was scheduled specifically because this is a day when undergraduates are out of classes, and the idea was to provide an opportunity and a forum to engage them around many of these issues as in response initially to the fact that the undergraduates were the ones who led the protests in support of the students at the University of Missouri. I think that we all recognize that there are ways in which that we could perhaps strengthen our relationships, to the community. And many people on the panel have kind of given a nod to that in their responses in ways in which we try to do so. As Adam kind of pointed out earlier, time for all of us is just this precious commodity that does not allow for us to do anything that is totally convenient for everyone. And so sometimes in getting something started, we may make a decision that may not necessarily be one that is convenient for some people, but it should not in any way be viewed as any attempt to exclude anyone. We very much welcome the support and the active engagement of the community, not just Hyde Park itself specifically, but we think about the community very broadly in terms of all of those who are engaged in efforts around social justice that are supporting the issues that we've articulated here with this particular panel, and those issues that will be a part of the discussion for the rest of the day. I'll ask you now if you join me in thanking our panel. And their insightful comments, and I encourage you to continue to engage in the rest of the day's activity. Thank you very much.